Good morning. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation. I seem to be a little loud, at least from where I'm standing. We welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house as we prepare to begin, if you'll check your cell phones to see that they have been turned off as a courtesy to our presenters. And of course, we will post the program later today and tomorrow on our website for everyone's future reference. Our internet viewers are always welcome to send their comments or questions, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Jim Roberts. Mr. Roberts is a research fellow for economic freedom and growth in our Center for International Trade and Economics. His primary focus is on the production of Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom. He also studies economic and political issues in Latin America and Europe, as well as development assistance and nation-building items. Prior to joining us here, he served at the State Department for 25 years with tours of duty at U.S. embassies in Mexico, Portugal, France, Panama, and Haiti. He also helped coordinate several major U.S. assistance programs, including efforts to reform Eastern Europe economies and most recently to reconstruct Iraq. Before entering public service, he was a financial analyst at the Ford Motor Company, and he also served in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Jim Roberts. Jim.
Thank you, John. Good morning and welcome to Heritage. Perhaps because of the unpopularity of Obamacare, lately, progressives have decided to try to change the subject to inequality. We can expect to hear a lot about that tomorrow night in the State of the Union address. That makes today's panel very timely, all the more so because of the publication a few weeks ago of the 2014 Index of Economic Freedom, the 20th anniversary edition. Indeed, as the index demonstrates, it is in countries where they have higher levels of economic freedom where we find greater prosperity for everyone, higher economic growth levels, larger per capita incomes, less poverty, better health care, education, and environmental protection. These are also the countries that have historically had greater upward mobility, more opportunities for economic and social success. We're privileged this morning to have with us a speaker who is an internationally known and respected expert on economic freedom and on these issues, Dr. Don Boudreaux. Professor Boudreaux is professor of economics and chair for the study of free market capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He earned his PhD in economics at Auburn and a law degree from UVA, and Professor Boudreaux blogs every day at cafehayek.com. To set the stage for Professor Boudreaux's remarks, I'm delighted to welcome as panelists two of my Heritage colleagues, Ryan Olson and Donald Schneider, who have both published reports recently on these issues. Ryan, in our Center for International Trade and Economics, has a Bachelor in Political Science from James Madison University and just earned his Master's of Science in International Commerce and Policy at George Mason. He is a former congressional staffer and also spent a year in the country of Georgia teaching English. Donald Schneider is in the Center for Policy Innovation at Heritage with a BS in Economics from the College of Charleston. He earned a Master of Science in Applied Economics with a certificate in National Security from the Johns Hopkins University. He is also a former intern with Congressman Paul Ryan, who in fact himself in turn was an intern, and also worked at the Heritage Center for Health Policy Studies. So Ryan and Don will present briefly some highlights of their findings, and then Professor Boudreaux will help us make sense of it all. So, gentlemen, take it away. I think it's going to be Donald Schneider first, right?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Is this on? Okay. So I'm going to take a little different approach, and I guess which has been very international and macroeconomic, and I'm focusing more on the individual level in terms of economic mobility. So this is what I study in our Center for Policy Innovation, upward mobility mainly, so which is the kind of the study of how individuals move up and down the income distribution conditional on certain characteristics. So there's a few kind of ways that we look at it, whether it's an intergenerational aspect, as in what happened in the parent distribution, and then what happens in the child's generation. So if you were born at the bottom, what's the likelihood you move around? We can look at it in an absolute or a relative context, absolute being kind of dollar terms, do you surpass your parents' income? Or in relative terms, how are you progressing compared to your peers? And likewise, there's upward movement, downward movement, in terms of persistence over time. So just to give you some context, this is what it looks like in the US. And this is kind of our strong suit. As you can see on the right, 84% of all Americans surpass their parents' income, which is, of course, inflation adjusted. And 93% of those born into the bottom quintile surpass their parents' income, which is a pretty good mark of opportunity and economic freedom. And I will note what's interesting is that for those at the 20th percentile in the children's distribution, they're about at the 57th percentile in their parent distribution. So that they would have been, by living standards today, they would have been kind of around middle class. But here's where we don't look quite so good in an international context. As you can see on the left side, this is what's deemed relative mobility. Previously it was absolute mobility. About 43% of those born into the bottom quintile remain within that bottom quintile. And conversely, 40% of those born into the top quintile will stay in the top. But I think there's a few caveats of measurement here. So you can be born into the bottom quintile and say experience great absolute mobility. You could, per se, quadruple your parents' income, but still remain in that bottom quintile because your income, because all of the quintile boundaries are changing. So your income didn't progress as quickly as others people's did. So how are economic freedom and mobility related? I think intuitively aspects of economic freedom affect how you interact with the labor market, how you generate earnings. So it's pretty intuitive that regulatory, business and labor freedom, investment freedom, freedom from corruption, and then the size, quality, and composition of transfers all affect how you interact with the labor market and then consequently your earnings. So kind of as a starting point, without economic freedom, if that doesn't take hold, it's hard for upward mobility and opportunity to take root as well. So it's important to note that economic mobility is a look-back measure. Typically, what we're doing is measures what occurred over time. So the literature mainly studies people born in the 1940s to the 1970s, and at its most recently, people born in the 1980s. So I think it doesn't give us, the data doesn't go back far enough to quite study how we'd want to, but I think it's a good indicator of what will occur in the future. So if economic freedom is slipping, it's likely that macroeconomic growth and absolute mobility will slow. If we don't have growth, you can't generate that rising tide that lifts all boats. But also, if corruption becomes more prevalent, then people at the top who may not merit their position there may be able to retain their position there. Likewise, excessive regulation or barriers to entry can keep people at the bottom from moving up who have really good ideas and deserve to move up. So I wrote a paper recently on a guide to understanding international comparisons of economic mobility. I won't go into too much detail about it, but essentially, for a lot of reasons of measurement, comparisons can be useful, but they can also be very misleading. So here's an illustration within the U.S. Going from left to right. This is showing the exact same income concept, but adjusted differently. So slowly start adjusting for household size, taxes, transfers, all those sorts of things, and at the end you emerge with a picture that's very different from the first one. This gives you kind of an idea of how tricky it can be, especially when mobility figures neglect these comparisons because they're often very difficult to do, especially internationally. And without going into too much detail, here you can see why. That these kind of transfer payments, which affect how you interact with the labor market and consequently the income that's used to measure how you progress over time, these transfers change very much over time, but also across countries. And then just kind of some intangible reasons which make this much more difficult to compare on an apples-to-apples basis is things such as culture or intangible qualities that you can't necessarily measure. So I thought this was actually kind of a very telling quote from Victor David Hanson. Essentially, he goes through this laundry list of reasons why opportunity might look different in different societies, and this is one quote from that. For the immediate future, don't expect a female business school valedictorian to manage Saudi Arabia's national oil company. Such exclusions derive from criteria other than innate talent, character, and industriousness, and can result in the lesser qualified being considered the only qualified. And kind of what this gives you some context as to what economic mobility can look like in an international context. For example, although no serious economist would make this argument, by certain measures, Pakistan and the U.S. have the same level of economic mobility as computed by one statistic. So if you took that at face value without knowing more about it, it could lead to some pretty misleading conclusions about opportunity. So yeah, as I stated earlier, unfortunately, we would want information about economic freedom ranging back into around the 1960s to kind of measure these things over time, which we don't have. But fortunately, we do know that either the countries that have very low economic mobility either don't even report income, so we can't measure them in the longitudinal way we would need to, or the ones that do, we do know they have much lower rates of economic mobility when they have lower rates of economic freedom. So to put this in some kind of visual context, this is a recent data showing the United States and Denmark. Denmark's actually renowned for its some of the highest rates of economic mobility in the world. So I guess it can be a bit confusing, but if you look at the horizontal axis, that's showing increasing parent income and their rank in the distribution, so your percentile. And then on the vertical axis is the mean child's outcome, their rank. So as you can see, if you look at around the bottom percentile, there's only a few percentile gap between Denmark and the U.S. And then that changes when you look at the top of the distribution. There's still again a few percentage point gap. But these are just measuring ranks in the distribution, not the actual dollar amount. At the upper end in the U.S., probably around the 40th percentile, we're actually seeing higher dollar absolute gains than they are, but their outcomes are higher at the bottom for us. For the people born into poverty, their mean outcomes are higher. But something that kind of confuses the analysis is that there's incredible spatial variation within the U.S. Like, as you saw previously, how much can that really tell you about the different kind of circumstances leading to opportunity and freedom in those countries? So here we see in the U.S. there's incredible variation in areas in the West and Midwest showing great rates of upward mobility, in areas in the South and even parts of the kind of the Rust Belt have very poor economic mobility. So this, again, in trying to draw apples-to-apples conclusions, Denmark has about 5 million people, about the size of metropolitan U.S. It's a very ethnically and religiously homogeneous population, whereas here in the U.S., we have incredible variation, much more diverse population, so it kind of confuses the analysis a bit. And so to give you some perspective, this is presented the same way as it was with Denmark, but here are two very different cities in the U.S. Salt Lake City having some of the blue line representing some of the best economic mobility in the developed world. When you look at it, it's even better than Denmark in many ways. But then you look at Charlotte, which is in fact much worse. If you look at the mean outcome for children born into poverty, it's much lower than it would be in Salt Lake City. So kind of what we do is we try to kind of understand what's associated here. And here is some recent data by some economists from Harvard and Berkeley. So to the right of this yellow line, they're showing what they found to be most strongly either positively or negatively correlated with upward mobility. And I highlighted them in red on the left side. But kind of, and I can go into them in a second, but here's the point. What works in the U.S. may not work in Denmark and vice versa, or in all these other countries. So we're just starting to kind of understand what's correlated. We haven't done any kind of causal inference yet to kind of understand what's going on. But it's very complicated in an international aspect. But so what they found is that aspects of income segregation, commute times were important. They did find that inequality was important, but that analysis can break down when you look at it certain ways. Of course, test scores, high school dropout rates were very important. Levels of social capital, religiosity, including a lot of family-related variables like the share of single mothers in a community, the divorce rates, the percentage who were married. So I guess just to conclude, I would say that there's a lot more at work here in determining upward mobility than simply economics. A lot of family, community, schools, habits, intangible aspects that you can't really pick up with measurement. Again, cross-national comparisons are very difficult to do in an apples-to-apples way. But I would say lastly, what's most important is that when you look at economic freedom, you want this to translate into a merit-based economy that eliminates barriers to entry and barriers to mobility for people to move up as well as down. All right, that's it. Thank you. Thanks, Donald. Thanks, Joe. I'm Joe. There you go. So the title of this discussion today is based off a paper that Jim and I did a couple months ago about healthcare and education and the environment related to economic freedom. So I'm going to talk about those findings a little bit, and I also wanted to, but before I do that, I wanted to kind of conceptualize or contextualize some of the findings that we did. And so to do that, I wanted to first show you all four graphs that'll kind of put what we did into perspective. So this is the first graph I came up with. This is world life expectancy from the year 1000 to the year 2003. And so as you can see, if you were born in the year 1000, chances of you living past the age of 25 were very small. It wasn't until the early 20th century that we actually see a rapid increase in life expectancy. And today, actually in 2003, which is about a decade ago, life expectancy is about 65. It's obviously higher nowadays. Next is poverty rates, and this shows poverty as measured by the World Bank from 1980 to 2010. The main indicator that the World Bank uses is poverty below 125, or to measure poverty is people earning less than $1.25 a day. And so as you can see, poverty rates have declined drastically over the past 30 years to about 55% or 50% in 1980 to about 30% today, so almost in half. And lastly, this is the literacy rate measured from 1990 to 2009. 1990 was the first year the World Bank started to kind of collect an aggregate literacy rate for the entire world. So in 1990, the literacy rate for the world was about 76%, and today it's about 84%. So about an 8% increase in literacy rate over the past 2 decades. So I think the question is, how did we start to improve all these factors, all these categories, literacy, education, health, and I think the main answer is economic growth. And so this is a demonstration of the world domestic product from the year 1 AD until the year 2012. And so as you can see, the growth over the past almost century has been almost exponential. There was essentially no economic activity going on literally up until the 1913, and that's when we started to see rapid rises in economic prosperity and economic growth. So just to give you some perspective, this is measured inflation adjusted 1990 international dollars. Today, the world domestic product is about $83 trillion. The U.S. makes up 15 trillion of that. So the question is, what happened? How do we do this? How do we get from no prosperity, no economic activity to today? And so what's the riddle? So what I want to do now is kind of, without oversimplifying, go into some of the reasons why I think that we've been able to achieve this rapid increase in prosperity. So the first year I want to start with is 1846. And this is the year that the Corn Laws in the United Kingdom were repealed. And the Corn Laws were a series of import duties, that protected domestic agriculture in the United Kingdom and shielded them from cheap foreign imports, particularly from Russia and the United States. And so this made corn in the United Kingdom incredibly expensive. In 1846 is the year that they were repealed. And this the corn price after 1846 dramatically decreased, and Russia and the United States became major suppliers of corn to the United Kingdom. So this had pretty much three benefits. First, it brought it opened up a major market for U.S. corn producers. They were able to benefit. Second, it opened up a major market for Russian corn producers. And third, it allowed citizens of the UK to buy cheap corn, which is healthy and increases their health outcomes. The second year I want to talk about is 1861, and this is the year that 23 million serfs in Russia were freed from their tie to the land. This allowed them to own property, own businesses, and move around and sell their labor freely wherever they like. So a long time serfs were tied to the land. This kind of freed them and allowed them to own private property. The next one is 1945. We all know this year. This is the year fascism was defeated in Italy and Germany. So this is kind of the overcoming of centralized nationalized political or economic control, and also freed up labor and capital from militarization. The next year is 1973. This is one of the main rounds of GATT before the World Trade Organization was created in the early 90s. And this is the most dramatic increase in members of GATT, which is generalized agreement on tariffs and trade. And this is essentially a free trade agreement. So this 1973 was the most dramatic increase in membership in this treaty, and it increased members from 62 to 100, and dropped tariffs by a third, and that equaled about $300 billion. Next year is 1978. This is the year that Deng Xiaoping opened up China to the world and started to privatize farms and also create special economic zones. And this has really been the catalyst for Chinese economic growth over the past couple of decades. And lastly, this is the fall of the Berlin Wall. This should be obvious to everybody, the defeat of communism in the early 1990s. So what does this kind of picture that I just painted show us? And I think it pretty much shows us that economic freedom has been the driving force of prosperity over the past maybe millennium, and the upward march of economic growth and prosperity has been marked by the upward march of economic freedom. And each of these developments that I've listed has marked an increase in economic freedom and an increase in prosperity. So the Corn Laws and GATT are, these are all factors that we measure in our index of economic freedom. The Corn Laws and GATT are our open markets, emancipation of the serfs, regulatory freedom, and labor freedom. Defeat of fascism is an example of limited government kind of taking back some of that government spending that was used for the military and for large social programs, giving back to private individuals. And then China and the Berlin Wall, you could argue, could be an example of the rule of law. So if economic freedom leads to prosperity, leads to health and educated societies, then how can we prove this? And that was what this paper that Jim and I worked on. So that was our hypothesis. How do we prove that we can correlate economic freedom to increases in social goods? So the first thing we started off was with education. And we tried to measure three things with education, three different factors: literacy, educational quality, and the time you spend in school. So this is the first factor we measured. This is literacy rates compared to quartiles of index of economic freedom. So as you can see, the countries with the most economic freedom also have the highest literacy rates at 94.5%. And the countries on the lower range, the third and fourth quartile, have the lowest levels of economic freedom around the world. Secondly, we tried to measure, it's not just, it's okay to have measurements of literacy, but it's also need to have some sort of measurement of outcomes. So we measured test scores that are taken by the OECD. They're the PISA test scores. And as you can see from this chart, higher levels of economic freedom indicate better outcomes in education, so higher test scores. And lastly, we measured time spent in school. And so, as you can see, the more economic freedom you have, the greater chance your children are going to spend more time in school. And actually, if you live in a country that has a higher level of economic freedom, you're more likely to spend up to 4 years more in school than if you live in a quartile of lower economic freedom. Next thing we turned to was infant mortality, and the two basic we turned to healthcare, and the two basic measurements of that are infant mortality and life expectancy. So as you can see from here, this is infant mortality. This is measured by the UN's Human Development Index. So countries with low levels of economic freedom, that translates into increased risk that your child's going to die around their birth. In addition, life expectancy, if you live in a country with high levels of economic freedom, you're going to live longer, have a more prosperous life, or a longer life, and obviously more prosperous if you do live longer. And obviously, these two indicators, life expectancy and infant mortality, are closely linked to the personal environment that you live in. So to measure this are clean water and improved sanitation. This is something we do every day. We take showers, we go to the bathroom. And clean water and improved sanitation are highly linked to diseases. So if we can determine, if we can draw a link between economic freedom and clean water and sanitation, kind of gives you an idea of the improved environments, personal environments. So this is two indicators done by the World Bank. Clean water and improved sanitation measured against economic freedom. As you can see, both strong correlations there as well. So this indicates that the personal environments that we enjoy here are highly correlated to economic freedom. And lastly, we looked at the environment, and this is kind of something that surprised me personally, because it kind of goes against the narrative that we always hear in the media, that we need more regulation to control our environments and to produce good environmental outcomes. So we took the Yale University's Environmental Performance Index, which measures environmental health, like air quality and sanitation, as well as ecosystem health, like environmental pollution. And so on the chart on the left, you can see that index of economic freedom, higher levels of economic freedom correlate to better environmental performance. And again, going back to this narrative, if we look at the last 10 years, you would kind of perceive that our environment is slowly crumbling and that we've been having worse environmental outcomes. Well, it's not necessarily the case. As economic freedom has increased over the last 10 years, the environmental performance index has followed the same trend line growth, and we've seen similar percentage increases in both indexes over the past 10 years. So that was a brief summary of our findings, Jim and I's. And in closing, I just want to say that I think that we'll never give up our desire to get better health care for ourselves, or better education, or better social outcomes. And likewise, I don't think we should ever give up on getting better and increasing in economic freedom, no matter where we are on any measure of economic freedom. So, thank you.
Great. So now we'll hear from Professor Boudreau. I think he'll be speaking up here. I would just note it's interesting that those improving numbers that Ryan talked about starting in the year 1913 were done in spite of the fact that that was the year that the Federal Reserve was created and the U.S. income tax was imposed. But please, Dr. Boudreau.
Thank you. It's great to be here. These are both fine papers. They're actually part of a surprisingly large and growing literature on the relationship between economic freedom and human flourishing, whether it's measured narrowly in terms of material well-being or more broadly in terms of just flourishing, material well-being combined with access to culture, a cleaner environment. The standard, if you studied economics, certainly, the standard narrative that economists say, and this is economists on all sides of the political aisle, economists say, well, the main reason for government action is market failure. You know, they have the factory that spews soot, and that can't be solved by typical standard market arrangements, so we need government to perform these kind of collective action services for us. I understand the logic of that. There's a kernel of truth to it, but I think practically that narrative is backwards. In my view, the typical reason why, the overwhelmingly important reason why government grows is not because of market failure, it's because of market success. The market succeeds so incredibly well, almost on a daily basis, and it does so silently that we in the West take it for granted. We think that the world we live in is somehow normal. We think it's normal that you can pop little round things into your eyes and correct your vision. We think it's normal that you can get into a vehicle, a metal vehicle that has explosions going on within it, and drive across the bridge. We think it's normal that we, in our lifetime, we will never have to worry about starving to death. We think it's normal that we take a bath or a shower every day. We think it's normal that people fly in fixed-wing aircraft. We live in a bizarre world. Our world is incredibly unusual. It's historically off the charts weird, but it's wonderful. And I'm going to stick with the theme that it is a wonderful world, and I believe that that wonder is the consequence of economic freedom specifically, and a little bit more generally of what the economist Deirdre McCloskey calls the bourgeois revaluation, the event in sometime about 300 years ago when it began, when people began suddenly to regard bourgeois virtues as indeed virtues rather than as something contemptible. And that attitudinal change combined with greater security of property rights, greater freedom of trade, launched this incredible wealth explosion that we enjoy. So I have a few pictures. My pictures are not as sophisticated as my colleagues' pictures. And as you can I know it doesn't look this way, but I'm a bit older than they are. I'm glad you recognize that as a joke. And the bit part, I'm a lot older than they are, and I have the misfortune of remembering the 1970s, because I was born in 1958, and so I hear this narrative that's been around for quite some time now that, the world was pretty good back then, but starting in 1970, middle-class Americans' living standards peaked in the 1970s, and they've stagnated ever since. Yeah, I remember the 1970s. I entered high school I entered my senior year of high school in 1975, and I compare my life today to what I remember life back in the 1970s. It seems to me that ordinary Americans live a lot better today than back then. My parents were working class people back in New Orleans, and so I think you have to be careful about drawing scientific inferences from your own personal experiences. But I don't think one's memories are insignificant. So I have a few pictures to show you that I think are relevant. So this narrative has been going around. You can find data for it. I won't present those data, but you can find data. If you look at, for example, the inflation-adjusted household income in America from the mid-'70s up until just before the recession. I stopped my analysis just before this recession, since I think it's an anomaly. That household income has stagnated. If you look at the average wage rate, inflation-adjusted wage rate of the typical non-supervisory, as the government calls it, worker in America, adjusted for inflation, it hasn't changed at all since the 1970s. It's a flat line. It looks really bad. And so if you are of the left and you're convinced that by the way, another event that happened in 1978, in addition to the beginning of the liberalization of the Chinese economy, was that's the date I have in mind for the deregulation events in the U.S. Of course, the United States did not, starting in the late 70s and early 80s, become a laissez-faire utopia. We still had regulation, we still had taxes, we had indeed some new regulations. But it is true that there was a movement toward deregulation, and I'm convinced, and I'm just psychoanalyzing here, but I'm convinced that a lot of people on the left believe that one reason why the data show that middle-class American living standards, or can be interpreted to show that middle-class American living standards have stagnated, is because of deregulation. It's because of the deregulation of trucking, because of the deregulation of airlines, because of the reduction in marginal tax rates, the continuing loss of influence of labor unions. That started back in the mid-1950s, by the way. And so if you are combining in your mind the belief that deregulation must be bad, low taxes must be bad for the economy, and look at some of these data, you say, aha, it all makes sense now. That's why Americans are stagnating, middle-class Americans are stagnating economically. So here are, let me see if I can, there we go. This is a picture, by the way, all these pictures that I'm going to show you, or most of them, I took with my cell phone, which itself is kind of incredible. If you mentioned in 1975 that someone could take a picture with their telephone, you wouldn't have been believed. So I said I entered my senior year of high school in the fall of 1975. For those of you not of my age, much younger, Sears was the closest thing we had to the Amazon.com of my generation. And it came in these huge catalogs. It'd be 3 every year. There'd be the fall, winter, the spring, summer, and the Christmas wish book. And Sears' motto back then used to be, Sears has everything. It wasn't literally true, but it was close to being literally true. Sears was the great retailer for middle America. And so let's look at the actual prices of things that Sears sold in 1975. And let's forget about adjusting for inflation. I think that causes a lot of trouble. And let's ask, how many hours did the typical American worker, the typical ordinary production line American worker, have to work to buy these various products in this year's catalog? I'm not going to go through all 469 pages of the catalog. I had just a few samples for you, but I've done it pretty much. The typical American worker in 1975 earned $4.73 per hour. The typical non-supervisory production line worker. We're not talking about the Howard Hugheses of the world back then. The average wage of the typical worker, full-time worker, was $4.73 an hour. And so, I should say, I got this catalog. I bought it a few years ago on eBay. There was no eBay in 1975. And although I didn't need it right away, I had eBay overnight it to me. The catalog cost me 99 cents. It cost me $19.99 to have it shipped to me. Now, I did that because I wanted to be able to say I had it shipped to me overnight. In 1975, I'm sure President Ford or whoever was the head of the defense secretary, probably Howard Hughes, could have things shipped overnight. Ordinary Americans couldn't have anything shipped to them overnight or shipped from them overnight. I had this shipped to me overnight at a fairly modest cost. And so here are just a few pictures. So this is a coffee maker. I'm a big fan of coffee because I drink too much at night and I need a lot of coffee in the morning when I wake up. So this is a 10-cup coffee maker. In 1975 dollars, you can't see, it's a little small, it costs $36.49. Now, this is a very basic coffee maker. It has no timer on it, it has no clock on it. It's a carafe, and it's a plastic thing we can put a filter and coffee in. So if you earned $4, if you're a typical American worker back then, you had to work nearly a day, 7.7 hours, to buy that coffee maker. This is a picture of a similar coffee maker. The 10-cup coffee maker that I found on Amazon.com. At today's wage rate for that typical worker today makes $20.35. That worker has to work 40 minutes to buy that basic coffee maker. So we're certainly better off coffee maker wise. This is a pair of jeans. I don't do a lot with clothing in the catalog because looking at 1970s clothing from the perspective of 2014 is really aesthetically challenging. It's really hideously ugly clothing. I'm embarrassed to say what kind of shoes I wore, but if those of you who remember what kind of shoes Elton John wore back then, you'll remember, you'll get some hint. Another reason why don't you do much with clothing is because it's very difficult to go through the catalog and find clothing of the sort that, not just stylistic-wise, but quality-wise that we would wear today. Very little of the clothing in 1975 was all cotton or all wool or all linen. Most of it was made out of oil, and it was made out of polyester. But I found a few that were made out of cotton. So here's a pair of jeans. And those jeans, if a typical American worker in 75 wanted to buy a pair of jeans, he or she had to work an hour and a half. Today, this is off Sears.com. A typical American worker, to get a similar pair of all-cotton jeans, has to work 41 minutes. It's a significant reduction in work time. Luggage. An interesting thing about looking through the Sears catalog is finding what's not there. No luggage in 1975 had wheels on it. Right? It was really luggage. You had to pick it up and lug it. Right? Today we have rollage. Right? But there was no rollage in that catalog. It was all luggage. And so I chose the sort of middle quality piece of luggage that Sears sold. Typical worker had to work 7 hours to buy that larger piece. Now you could buy wheels for the luggage. You bought that separately. You can see it there. And that cost an extra 4.4 hours. So to buy that one piece of sort of middle-sized luggage, to get the wheels for it, which you had to attach manually, you had to work almost a day and a half if you were an ordinary worker back then. Here's a picture of modern rollage. I'm trying to get that word into the language. It's because we have rollage now. You never see people lugging their things through airports. Typical worker, to get the same cubic inch size, only 5.5, I'm pointing at the computer because that's where I can see it, 5.5 hours of work as compared to over 12 hours of work. And by the way, before I go on, one of the things that a lot of people on the left don't like is, as I mentioned, is deregulation. I think there's something of a connection between wheels on luggage and improvements in luggage and deregulation. 1978 was the year of airline deregulation. It was a luxury to fly in a plane for an ordinary American prior to the 1980s. It's no longer a luxury. Airports are like bus stations now. I think it's a good thing. I've heard people complain about it. Well, I remember back in the day, everybody dressed up. It was a big event. Now, it's a madhouse. It is a madhouse. We all know that there are problems. There are headaches flying. But with so many Americans flying, having the demand to have suitcases that you can roll increases. So now all suitcases. I mean, if you go into Macy's or Sears to buy a piece of luggage without wheels on it, that would be weird, I think. So we have rollage. Use that word. I like this picture because this is an exercise. This is an exercise bike. The Dr. Seuss lady does not come. She comes separately. It cost what is that? Nearly 2 days worth of work to buy that exercise machine. A similar thing, 5.4, and it takes up less space in your basement. Music is wonderful. I'm a big Beatles fan. This is a picture of those of you who are of a certain age, you don't know what this is. This is called a 45. Right? It's actually a piece of plastic, vinyl. It has grooves cut in. It's kind of a weird thing. And then you put the needle in the groove and you spin it around. It would make sounds. And it would kind of scratchy a little bit. And every now and then, it would get stuck. Right? But you'd buy it and you'd take it home and you'd put it on your turntable and you'd listen. You got two songs. You got the A side and the B side. It cost 99 cents back in 1975. So it took the typical worker about 13 minutes of work to buy that record. So roughly 6.5 minutes per song. What do you do for music today? It's that. It's the iTunes symbol. You can get one song for roughly 4 minutes of work, and it's not scratchy. It never gets stuck. I know there are audiophiles who swear that vinyl is better. I'm not an audiophile, I confess, but I like digital. None of my digital recordings have ever gotten stuck. And you hear a song. Oh yeah, I remember that song, "Yellow Submarine" by the Fab Four. Okay, I have it. Right? You get it instantaneously now. Back then, you had to go to the store. We're much better off, music-wise. Sears Best typewriter. It's hard to tell because the picture's a little bit small, but they show the electrical cord, so it's an electrical typewriter. It's a fancy one. It's Sears Best. It cost 57 hours of work. That doesn't include the ink cartridge. That does not include the whiteout fluid. That does not include the carbon paper that you would need. I'm sure it was a fine typewriter, but it's very difficult to surf the web on that typewriter, I suspect. So what today? This is, of course, who buys typewriters today? Sears doesn't sell typewriters. I couldn't find a typewriter on Amazon. You find ancient ones. People buy them as antiquarian devices. 52 hours. So you say, well, it's almost the same price as a typewriter. Just a little bit less. But what do they have in common? Well, you can write a document with them. They both have keyboards. But that's so much better. In 1975, the idea of using a personal computer, and that's a Mac. It's sort of up top of the line when you can get PCs, of course, for much less expenditure of work time. That's an amazing improvement in our material standard of living. But now, because we're so accustomed to them, we take them for granted. They're like pigeons in Central Park. You just expect to find them. And they become part of the background. The markets produce them, and it was very silent about producing them. Of course, a lot of people made a lot of money producing them, but now we just expect them, and so we live in this world of wonders, and we don't recognize them as wonders. The microwave oven, 93 hours of work today, similar power, similar cubic inches, 4 hours of work. By the way, a lot of the things like the music calculators that you could buy, were expensive in 1975. Now they're on your cell phone, and they're apps. And I'm kind of I have a feeling that pretty soon the microwave oven will be an app too. You zap your food, and you don't have to buy the mic. You don't have to buy the microwave. Television. In 1975, Sears sold no television with remote control. Now I know there were TVs in 1975 with remote control. Sears sold no TVs with remote control. Remote controls back then were the old-fashioned kind. They were children. Son, change channel. Right? It wasn't too big a deal. Only 4 channels to change to, but you could change channel. So, but look at that, a month's worth of work to buy that TV. Now that TV has certain advantages over modern TVs. You can put a fishbowl on top of that TV, or a work of art. It's hard to do that on a flat screen TV, but obviously it's not high def. It broke down frequently, being quite serious, those of you who remember that, they broke down frequently, and you'd call the TV repairman, and the TV repairman would come out a day or two later, and you had to pay him, and he came out and he fixed the TV, and 7 or 8 months later, he'd come on again to fix the TV, and they were always, the vertical hole was being lost, the horizontal hole was going screwy, there was no surround sound, it was color. Finally, by then, it was becoming kind of decent by the mid-'70s, but it was very, it just incomparably inferior to that. I just got a picture of a TV. Oh, this is from Target, 17.1 hours. And I did this a few weeks ago. It's probably going down to 16.1 hours by now. But you can't put a fishbowl on it, and it does come with remote control. Now, I show you these pictures. Believe me, you can go through the whole catalog. I've done it. There are very, very few of the thousands of items that Sears sold in the mid-1970s that are not today less expensive in terms of the work time required of ordinary Americans to purchase. And by the way, what's true of ordinary Americans, I'm sure is true of almost anyone in the West. There are a handful of items, but they are very, very rare. And that fact alone, I think, gives great lie to the myth that that middle-class Americans' living standards have stagnated since the 1970s. It cannot possibly be that ordinary Americans can buy almost everything they could buy in 1975 at a much lower expenditure of work time costs today, and have our living standards be stagnant over that period of time. There are other data and that we could turn to that I think not destroys, but challenges this myth of stagnation. I just show you some of it, and I have on my blog, I have longer presentations. I've looked back to the 1950s. A few months ago, Paul Krugman was writing in the New York Times about what a glorious time the mid-1950s were economically. They were a great time, and suggesting that today is ordinary Americans are struggling compared to what their parents and grandparents were living like in the 1950s. I think that's just crazy. So you go back to the 1950s catalog, which I've done, and it's even more extreme. The reduction in work time costs are even greater. Now I'm looking at some catalogs from the early 1980s, and similar story. Everything is getting, almost everything is getting cheaper. And I didn't say much, I alluded a little bit, but obviously quality has improved greatly. Shifting gears a little bit, so Ryan mentioned at the end of his talk, and he said it's kind of surprising, and it kind of is, because another narrative we hear is that, well, capitalism or free markets, yeah, they deliver all these goodies, but they make our environment really dirty. I mean, we purchase our material prosperity at the expense of a dirtier environment. I think this is crazy. I think, I'll pass that. I think this is celery. I'll explain celery in a moment. I think our environment's getting cleaner. This celery bag sort of combines both parts of my remarks here. This is a celery bag that I bought at a giant supermarket this past summer. And you might not be able to tell, but it's got a resealable top. And I took the picture with my cell phone and downloaded it on my computer now. Then on my thumb drive, now I'm showing it to you. You could buy celery in the mid-1970s. That was easy enough. And you'd buy it in a plastic bag. It did not have a resealable top. I guarantee it did not have a resealable top. This one has a resealable top. Seems like a small thing. And in a sense, it is a small thing. It's not like you feel your world has been rocked when you go into the supermarket and say, wow, a celery bag with a resealable top, right? I'm glad I've lived long enough to see this, right? But I think this is a good symbol of the kind of world we live in. We live in a world in which almost every day there are these minor improvements in our standard of living, most of which are really small. The internet now is considered, it's taken for granted, but when it came out, it wasn't small. That was kind of big. Digital photography was kind of big. But these things are not very big. You notice it, you go, ah. But I think these are the bulk. These kinds of innovations are the bulk of the reason for why we live in an ever-improving world driven by innovative market capitalism. I don't know how much of the price of this celery it includes the cost of compensating whoever it is that supplied that resealable bag, but part of it is this celery is a little bit better than the celery you bought 30 years earlier, because now you can seal it and keep it fresher a little bit longer. Its expected life is kept a little bit better. It's easier for you to keep it fresher than in the past. So not only does capitalism produce it's a continuing stream of small innovations that make our world better. An important aspect of this improved world is we live in a cleaner world. Capitalism cleans our environment. That's one example. It's a really small example. Your celery doesn't get stale or brown as quickly as before. But here are other ways in which, just some samples in which capitalism cleans our environment. I apologize for this. The idea came to me when I was standing before one of these things. This is a urinal in Dulles Airport. Many years ago, about 10 years ago, I was in LaGuardia Airport, New York, and I realized this was my road to Damascus moment. I realized that a modern airport bathroom, it's an astonishingly clean place. Right? Think about it. Right? There are no doors. Right? There's the labyrinth entrance, and in most airports they're big, so you could roll your rollage right through there. You go to a urinal or a toilet. It flushes itself. Put your hand under the faucet, water comes out on its own. You wave your hand before the towel dispenser, it comes out on its own, and then you throw the towel into the open mouth trash container. You don't touch anything but yourself. Right? These are all capitalist innovations. Not to mention, the cleanliness of the water, the soap, the air conditioning in the place, or the central heating, the cleanliness of the building itself. Capitalism helps make our world cleaner. Yes, these things were produced by industrial processes that they may have emitted some extra amounts of sulfur dioxide or CO2 into the atmosphere. Those pollutants, whether you call them pollutants or not, have to be weighed. The cost of those have to be weighed against the benefits that we don't even think of as benefits. We take them for granted when assessing whether or not capitalism makes our world better. This is underwear. This is really a salacious thought. Underwear is remarkable. He died this past year. The late economic historian from Harvard, David Landis, who was certainly no libertarian or free market zealot, he wrote in his 1998 book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, that the development of underwear was a great health benefit in industrial revolution era Britain, because people couldn't afford changes of clothing. But the textile industry, which was the first industry of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, it made for the first time machine woven, hence really seriously washable underwear available to the masses. So that enabled the masses who didn't bathe regularly and who worked in one pair of clothes day in, day out, to put for the first time inexpensive garments between themselves and their bacteria-ridden clothing. Underwear are a major cleanliness benefit of capitalism. A hard roof. This is a picture of part of the roof of my house in Virginia. So a hard roof. Who thinks of hard roofs? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, almost everyone, unless you were in the nobility or the royalty, almost everyone lived under a thatched roof, which had birds and wasps and spiders in it, and they caught fire. And it didn't really keep out rain very well. Hard roofs keep us cleaner and hence keep us healthier. The light bulb, actually we should say a hosanna to this, it's disappearing, sadly enough. This is an incandescent light bulb. Prior to the light bulb, people had to burn some fuel in their home, which itself it created indoor pollutants. The light bulb is much less, not polluting at all in the home, yes, to produce the power to light the light bulb from some generating plant adds to pollution, but that pollution has to be weighed against the benefits of the reduction of in-home pollution that the light bulb represents. Refrigeration. This is a cleanliness machine. It keeps our food cleaner for longer, helping also to reduce the risk of starvation and malnutrition, which enables our bodies to keep up our resistance against diseases. Who thinks of refrigeration as an anti-pollution device, but I think plausibly it can be classified as one. Automatic dishwashers. I like to call this also a recycling machine. I'm a pretty radical free market guy. I don't think of myself as a recycler, but in fact I do recycle. When I don't eat all my food, I don't throw it away. I recycle it. I put it in the refrigerator and save it for tomorrow. Right? I don't throw my dishes away every time I use them. I put them in here. I recycle them for another use. I have another set of recycling machines in my home, a washer and dryer. Put my clothes in there. Almost every piece of clothing that I have on here today I've worn before. These machines enable us to keep our clothes cleaner. This is one of the greatest anti-pollutants of all time. This is an antibiotic, which protects us from the bacteria that was a major pollutant killer of all of our ancestors. Asphalt, it's not a very pretty picture. Asphalt looks ugly, right? Paves over the green, verdant meadows that we like to look at. Asphalt with the car. I think these are some of the two greatest anti-pollutant devices in the world. I mean, what was life like before the automobile? You had horse-drawn carriages in cities and towns, and they had their own emissions. They were just different than the kind of emissions that come out of the automobile, and they drew flies and other insects, and those flies and other insects would eat the emissions, and then they would fly into your unair-conditioned house because you didn't have air conditioning, and you didn't even have, by the way, you didn't even have mesh screens until the 1890s. And so in the summer, in any city that got hot, which is, of course, any city in the eastern United States and Canada, you had to open your windows. You had flies eating the vehicle emissions on the street, and they would fly then into your house and alight upon your sandwich or your steak, and spreading disease. So if you look around, you see things in our society that, if you don't take them for granted, you recognize them as marvels. We live in this world of wonders, almost all of which are the product of innovative industrial capitalism, made possible by security of property rights, economic freedom, and free trade. And so this narrative that somehow capitalism fails, or that it pollutes our environment, or that it's been stagnating over the past 3 or 4 decades, I think is just false. And so looking at the world a little bit more creatively than most people look at most people in the mainstream media, most people in the mainstream academia, by the way, look at the world is necessary. The way that my 2 colleagues looked at the world is part of that. They asked the right questions and came up with different answers. But there are other ways to do it as well. And so I dissent from the notion that economic freedom doesn't work. I dissent from the notion that capitalism pollutes our environment, and I dissent from the notion that American middle classes have been stagnant over the past 30-odd years. Let me get just one small remark. I do not mean to be a Pollyanna. I have learned, I think, over my many years of pondering these matters, that the market is a much more robust institution than I once believed it to be. It can take a lot of pounding and still keep on keeping on. But that doesn't mean that its powers to keep on keeping on are unlimited. It can be killed. The goose that is laying these golden eggs can be slaughtered. And I don't know now how far off we are from slaughtering that goose. We're certainly closer now than we were 7 or 8 years ago. I don't think it's slaughtered yet, and I remain cautiously optimistic that it will survive this current round of animal abuse. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful presentations. And in the spirit of keeping the rollage going, as Dr. Boudreau's hometown, they might say, letting the good times roll for a few more minutes, we have some time for questions. So if you have one, if you can raise your hand, we'll have a microphone, I think, we can get to you. Please. Can you wait for the mic? Please.
Gordon Johnson, I'm a retired businessman. You gave a wonderful presentation of innovation at work coming from markets. Why in the schools do they spend all their time teaching about prices and equilibrium and sleight-of-hand curves and allocation of resources? And the word innovation never seems to come up in economics classes. You look at the back of an economics book and it isn't in the index.
Well, that's a good point. I'm going to dissent from it a little bit. I mean, first of all, at George Mason, where I am, we teach economics better than at most institutions, in my view. I think there is a place for the kind of static analysis that you're criticizing. I think the problem is that static analysis is taken by too many economists to be the be-all and end-all of the discipline. That's all they look at, and they don't stand back and look at the bigger picture. Most economists are ignorant of history. They're ignorant of everything but their very narrow field of economics, and they know that only increasingly in terms of mathematical equations. And so, because the typical economist is increasingly trained as, in formal methods, he or she thinks of himself as a kind of social engineer, and that's really bad because the social engineering economist, almost of necessity, must be blind to the creative, innovative forces of spontaneous order capitalism. And so, although I dissent a little bit, I agree with the thrust of your remark. But why economics is going down this road is a separate question. I don't know the answer to that. I know it's a shame that it has.
Other questions?
Can I follow that up?
All right.
Healthcare. Why the reception that Paul Ryan received for his voucher or premium support in healthcare has received no acceptance at all because it's been, I think, perhaps because it's presented as a cost saving. Most of what you were presenting was we save money. But isn't the real benefit that will come from the Republican proposals on healthcare not so much from the cost containment as it will the innovations that will come about if you had 50 million people buying health care instead of the government?
I confess, I haven't kept up as much as I should have with the details of the different health care plans, including Paul Ryan, so I can't comment on that with any great expertise. I will say that the public narrative about health care for so long has been that markets can't work. They simply can't work. It's just repeated now as if it's an established fact, as if it's, it's like the 11th commandment, etched in stone. And then I go into supermarkets and I look at the first 8 aisles. This is all healthcare, and small healthcare, but markets supply Band-Aids, they supply Neosporin, they supply rubbing alcohol. These are all healthcare things. Why can't markets supply larger price healthcare items? The reason, I think this narrative prevents too many American voters from being willing to rely more heavily upon market provision. I have no doubt that if the government would remove itself from the healthcare market, that the quality would rise even further, the availability would increase even more, and the cost to each user would fall dramatically.
Not to mention the life-saving drugs, the cholesterol. There's so many things now that have caused this increase in lifespan. The higher percentage of protein in diets is a major factor. But Well, if we don't have any other questions, Ambassador Miller, is this Director of our Center for International Trade and Economics.
Terry Miller, here at the Heritage Foundation. We're going to hear a lot tomorrow in the State of the Union address from the President about innovation. I think that's going to be a big theme, and he's going to probably propose some big government programs of one kind or another to promote innovation. And yet the story you've told us this morning was of massive amounts of innovation coming through the private sector, the free market, the capitalist system. And I guess my fear would be that these government programs actually may not promote innovation. They may have just the opposite effect of stifling it. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
You'll be shocked to learn that I agree with you. Yeah, the innovation, almost by its nature, can't be planned. Innovation can't be foreseen. It always amuses me. It's oftentimes politicians, not always, people go, well, this is the industry of the future. Well, how do you know? If it's really the industry of the future, you don't have to invest taxpayers' money. Invest your own money in it if you're so sure it's the industry of the future. No one in 1985 knew that online book selling or online clothes selling would be the industry among the industries of the future. They are. Of course, what happens with these government planned innovations is that a lot of money is forcibly taken away from people who otherwise might invest it or use it to explore genuinely innovative ideas. It's forced into some bureaucrats or politicians' notion of what the industry of the future will look like. And it's no surprise, we all know that far too many of these sorts of government planned industries of the future innovations, they all fail for a variety of reasons, not least of which is no one can foresee the future. And if you think you can foresee the future, and particularly if you're investing other people's money, then you're not foreseeing the future. You're forestalling the future as it would otherwise emerge. But you're right. We'll hear that, and it'll be applauded, and all the mainstream media will duly genuflect to the great, progressive insight of these people, because those of us who support free markets, of course, we don't really like innovation. The market is in fact, I wish. I'll shut up after this. I call it capitalism because most people do. For a variety of reasons. I think it's a bad term. The term that I would prefer is the system of entrepreneurial innovationism. Now that has even less prospect of being adopted than rollage, but that's really what it is: a system of open entrepreneurial innovation. That's the system that we live in, and it's a shame that the word capitalism doesn't really capture that essence.
And it's those innovations that create these disruptive,
Creative destruction.
creative destructions that we've been talking about. Okay, we can do one more question.
Francis Johnson. So will George Mason and others in academia turn to the challenge of creating messages that will inform the great American public as to where this change in life has been coming from, and relate that to these academic principles of free markets and property rights and non-regulation, so that the public can understand what's going on here?
Well, George Mason already has, I should say. The econ department of George Mason, we pride ourselves in our, I don't know what to call it, public outreach. We do a lot of blogging, unlike a lot of other economics departments. We reward our members for doing not only academic research and not only good teaching, but also writing for the Wall Street Journal, doing public talks. Most economists, actually it's probably a good thing since most economists, they have such a bad view of the economy, but George Mason has stood up to the plate, and we're taking our fair share of the pitches on that front. It is important that it be done. You're right.
Good. Well, as a symbol of our appreciation for Professor Boudreaux coming here today, we have two presents, two gifts for him. First, our index. Also, we have a piece of clothing that you have never worn before. So please join me in thanking our panel.